The clock on the wall of the Seoul penthouse read 11:30 p.m. Han Du-yoon sat in complete, suffocating darkness. The only light in the multi-million-dollar residence came from the electric glow of the skyline, framing his tattooed silhouette against the sprawling glass. Below, the city buzzed with a life he controlled but rarely joined, but up here the silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Du-yoon sat on the dark leather sofa, elbows resting on his knees. A cigarette burned between his fingers, the smoke curling upward into the shadows like an unsaid thought. He checked his luxury metal watch for the 5th time in 20 minutes. Where was she? He took a long drag, his jaw tightening as his eyes remained fixed on the front door like a predator waiting for prey to walk into a trap. As the head of a powerful syndicate, he commanded fear from every corner of the city. Men trembled at his name, yet right now the most dangerous man in Seoul was sitting in the dark, obsessed with the arrival of his maid. That fact made him angrier than anything else. The elevator dinged. Du-yoon's entire body tensed, a coiled spring ready to snap. He crushed his cigarette and fell back into the shadows, watching as the door opened. Aaliyah Mitchell walked in, looking professional and entirely too independent in her dark blazer. She was looking down at her phone, her thumb moving across the screen as if she had a whole world waiting for her outside these walls. She took 3 steps into the room before she felt it, that crackle of electricity in the air, the heavy atmospheric shift that always signaled his presence. Aaliyah looked up and her entire body froze. Du-yoon rose slowly from the couch, his tall frame casting a long, intimidating shadow against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The unbuttoned collar of his black shirt revealed the dark ink of his tattoos, armor that shimmered under the cold light of the skyline. Coming home at this hour? His voice cut through the silence like a blade, cold, controlled, yet carrying a vibration that sounded dangerously like pain. Aaliyah's heart slammed against her ribs. Du-yoon took a step toward her, his footsteps echoing like a countdown. "I asked you a question, Aaliyah," he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "Where were you?" Aaliyah moved through the vast, silent expanse of the penthouse with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to occupy space without truly inhabiting it. To the rest of Seoul, Han Du-yoon was a ghost, a name whispered in the backrooms of high-end clubs and the boardrooms of global conglomerates. To Aaliyah, he was a collection of habits, a sequence of expensive fabrics, and a mountain of unspoken trauma that she navigated every day. The invisible wall wasn't just a metaphor, it was the atmosphere of the $15 million Manhattan-style residence. She spent her mornings in the master suite, her dark hands moving over the silk linings of his custom-tailored suits. As she steamed the creases from his black shirts, she couldn't help but think of the man who wore them like armor. She was a ghost, much like the scholar she had once been back in Chicago, clinging to her dignity while surrounded by a wealth that felt both predatory and cold. She had memorized his rules. The absolute silence, the precise placement of his crystal ashtrays, and the one command that sat at the center of their lives like a landmine: never enter his private office. But more than the rules, she had memorized him. During the rare moments when he sat in his brooding vigils, his unbuttoned collar revealed glimpses of the jagged history etched into his skin. She had seen the white lines on his forearms and the thick silver mark on his side that whispered of a knife. They weren't just scars. They were the physical manifestations of a trust that had been murdered long ago. As she organized his wardrobe, she felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the man who treated her like an asset on a ledger. She was a resilient outsider, a woman who had survived the south side of Chicago and the loss of her mother, only to find herself captive to the gravity of a man who had forgotten how to breathe. She refused the expensive gifts he occasionally left for her, the designer bags and the diamond earrings that appeared like offerings on her bed. She wasn't his charity case and she wasn't another debt to be collected. Every time she returned them, leaving them outside his forbidden door, she was reinforcing the only boundary she had left. She was a human being, not his property, even if her heart began to hammer against her ribs whenever his dark eyes locked onto hers. She was merely waiting for the day she could step out of his shadow and into a future she had built for herself, one textbook and one night class at a time. The shift happened gradually, then all at once. 4 months, the rhythm of the penthouse had been as predictable as the ticking of Du-yoon's luxury watch. Aaliyah was always there, a quiet, efficient presence who vanished into her quarters by 8 p.m. and reappeared with the sunrise. But then came the first Wednesday in October. The clock struck 9, then 10, and the kitchen remained dark, the scent of her vanilla-scented soap noticeably absent from the hallway. Du-yoon stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection a ghost against the shimmering Seoul skyline. He told himself it was about security. She was a liability. If she were snatched by a rival, she knew too much about his private routines. But as the minutes bled into hours, the cold logic of a syndicate boss began to dissolve, replaced by a raw, jagged heat he hadn't felt in years. It was a territorial instinct, a possessive fire that licked at the edges of the invisible wall he had built around his heart. By the second week, the lateness became a pattern. Every Wednesday and Friday, Aaliyah would slip out in the early evening, dressed not in her uniform, but in dark, fitted clothing that made her look like she belonged to the world outside, a world Diyun couldn't follow her into. He found himself retreating into the shadows of the living room, refusing to turn on the lights. He sat in the velvet armchair, a glass of untouched whiskey sweating on the table beside him, his eyes fixed on the heavy oak door. He was a man who moved armies and dictated the flow of millions, yet he was reduced to a state of agonizing anticipation, his pulse quickening at every sound in the corridor. When she finally returned, the air in the penthouse would change, charged with a heavy, magnetic tension. She would move quickly, her head down, her smartphone clutched in her hand as if it held a lifeline to someone else. Diyun watched the way her chest heaved with exertion, the way a stray strand of hair clung to her damp forehead, and his mind spun dark, poisonous fantasies. Who was she meeting? Who was allowed to see the smile she never offered him? The internal walls Diyun had spent a decade reinforcing were no longer a fortress. They were a cage. Every time the elevator dinged after midnight, a new crack formed in his composure. The jealousy wasn't just a sting, it was a physical ache, a reminder that despite his power, he owned nothing of her spirit. He was a predator who had forgotten that his prey had wings, and as he watched her disappear into her room without a word, the silence of the penthouse felt less like peace and more like a declaration of war. The following Friday the elevator doors slid open at 12:15 a.m., but this time the darkness of the penthouse was alive. The moment Aaliyah stepped into the foyer, the click of a lighter sparked in the corner, illuminating Diyun's face for a fraction of a second before fading into a low orange ember. He didn't rise. He sat in the center of the sofa, the smoke from his cigarette drifting into the path of the air conditioner, cold and clinical. "You're late," he said, the words vibrating with a quiet, dangerous authority that made the air feel thin. Again. Aaliyah didn't flinch. She adjusted the heavy strap of her bag on her shoulder, her exhaustion manifesting as a sharp, defiant edge. "I didn't realize my life outside these chores was on a timer, Diyun." The use of his name without a title caused him to stand, his tall frame looming over her, a shadow that seemed to swallow the light from the hallway. He moved into her personal space, the scent of expensive tobacco and cedarwood enveloping her. He reached out, his tattooed fingers gripping the strap of her bag. To anyone else it would look like a gesture of assistance, but to Aaliyah, it felt like a claim. "Everything in this house is on my timer," he hissed, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of the betrayal he was certain he would find. "The clothes you wear, the food you eat, the roof over your head, I paid for it all. I bought your time, Aaliyah. Who are you giving it to for free?" He yanked the bag, the zipper catching and spilling its contents onto the polished marble floor. Diyun expected to see burner phones, jewelry from a rival, or hotel keycards. Instead, heavy, battered textbooks skidded across the floor. Advanced macroeconomics. International law. Principles of finance. Aaliyah looked down at the books, then back at the man who thought he could own the world. She didn't scramble to pick them up. She stood her ground, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a righteous, simmering fury. "I am not a spy and I am not a mistress," she said, her gaze locking onto his with a force that made him recoil internally. "I am a student. I am a woman trying to finish the life that was stripped away from me. You think because you pay my salary you own my soul?" She stepped closer, her chest nearly brushing the silk of his unbuttoned shirt. "Look at me, Diyun. I am a human being, not your property. You can keep your gifts and your money, but you will not take my future. I don't belong to the syndicate, and I certainly don't belong to you." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, Diyun saw the girl behind the maid, a woman whose resilience was more formidable than any armor he wore. As she knelt to gather her books, he watched her, his hand frozen in midair, the walls of his heart beginning to crumble under the weight of a truth he wasn't prepared to handle. The following days were marked by a silence that felt different, no longer the cold, sharp absence of sound, but a heavy, contemplative stillness that stretched between them. Diyun had retreated into his office for hours on end, while Aaliyah continued her work, her mind replaying the image of his stunned expression when her books had hit the floor. It was late on a Tuesday when the wall finally cracked. Aaliyah was in the laundry suite, steam rising from the industrial press as she worked on the final set of Do-yoon's shirts. She reached for a black silk garment he had worn during a particularly tense meeting, but as she moved to hang it, a small laminated photograph fell from the inner breast pocket. She hesitated, then picked it up. It was a wedding photo, but the edges were charred, as if someone had tried to burn the memory and lost their nerve halfway through. In the picture, a younger Do-yoon looked, for the first time she had ever seen, happy. Beside him stood a woman in a white lace gown, her hand resting on his arm. But it was the back of the photo that stopped Aaliyah's breath. In jagged, angry ink, a single date was crossed out, the night of the red vow. "That's a dead man's souvenir." Aaliyah gasped, spinning around to find Do-yoon leaning against the doorframe. He wasn't wearing his jacket or his armor. His shirt was open, and in the harsh fluorescent light of the laundry room, the scars she had glimpsed from afar were laid bare. The most prominent was a thick, knotted rope of scar tissue that began at his collarbone and disappeared beneath his ribs. "Her name was Yuna," he said, his voice a hollow rasp. He walked toward her, not with his usual predatory gait, but with a weary heaviness. "She was the daughter of a rival. I thought our marriage would bring peace. Instead, she brought a knife to the altar." He stopped inches from Aaliyah, his eyes fixed on the photo in her hand. "She didn't just want my life, she wanted the syndicate. She had been a mole for 3 years, feeding them every secret, every weakness I shared in the dark. The night we were supposed to say our vows, she tried to open my throat." Aaliyah looked from the jagged scar on his chest back to his face. For the first time, she didn't see a monster or a tyrant. She saw a man who had been hollowed out by the very people he was supposed to trust. His cruelty wasn't born of malice. It was a desperate, panicked reflex to keep anyone from getting close enough to finish what Yuna had started. "You think everyone is her," Aaliyah whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "Every time I'm late, every time I have a secret, you aren't angry at me. You're waiting for the knife." Do-yoon didn't answer. He simply reached out and took the photo, his fingers brushing against hers. For a heartbeat, the invisible wall vanished, leaving nothing but the raw, aching pulse of two people who had both learned that survival often meant living in the dark. While the air inside the penthouse had softened, the atmosphere within the syndicate's lower levels was beginning to boil. Co Jin-woo, Do-yoon's second-in-command, watched the security feeds from the sub-basement with a cold, calculating detachment. He had noticed the way Do-yoon's shoulders dropped when Aaliyah entered a room, and the way the boss's eyes no longer scanned for exits, but for her. To Jin-woo, this wasn't a romance, it was a security breach. A leader who felt was a leader who could be bled, and Jin-woo had no intention of sinking with a ship steered by a man blinded by a maid. Jin-woo moved with the clinical precision of a surgeon as he began to manufacture a digital reality of betrayal. He didn't need much, just enough to trigger the ghosts of Do-yoon's past. Sitting in a darkened van parked 3 blocks from the penthouse, he navigated through a series of encrypted servers, spoofing Aaliyah's IP address to create a trail of outgoing messages to Chairman Ryu, the syndicate's most vicious rival. He crafted a narrative of greed, making it appear as though Aaliyah was auctioning off Do-yoon's shipment schedules and private security codes to the highest bidder. The final piece of the trap required a physical touch. Taking advantage of the hour when Aaliyah was busy in the kitchen and Do-yoon was at a high-stakes meeting in Gangnam, Jin-woo used his master key to slip into Aaliyah's private quarters. The room was small and smelled of lavender and old paper. He ignored the stack of textbooks on her nightstand, the very things that had almost saved her, and reached behind the headboard of her bed. With gloved hands, he taped a small, untraceable burner phone to the frame. The device was already loaded with a string of fabricated, flirtatious texts from Ryu's top enforcer, thanking her for the inside look at the boss's weaknesses. It was a masterpiece of sabotage, designed to hit the exact frequency of Do-yoon's paranoia. Jin-woo paused for a moment, looking at a framed photo of Aaliyah's mother on the dresser. He felt no guilt. In his world, loyalty was a transaction, and Do-yoon was currently overpaying for a lie. He adjusted his tie in her mirror, a ghost in her sanctuary, before disappearing back into the hallway. The seeds of doubt had been planted in the digital soil. All that was left was to let Do-yoon's own trauma water them until they strangled everything he had dared to feel. He knew that once the boss saw the evidence, he wouldn't look for the truth, he would only look for blood. The fragile peace that had begun to settle over the penthouse was annihilated in a single, freezing instant. When Aaliyah returned from her Friday night class, she didn't find Do-yoon waiting in the living room with the heavy, magnetic longing of the previous weeks. Instead, the lights were blindingly bright, reflecting off the marble floors with a clinical, surgical glare. Duyun stood in the center of the foyer, his posture rigid, his face a mask of such profound emptiness that Aaliyah's heart seized. On the mahogany console table sat a small black burner phone and a stack of printed transcripts. The invisible wall hadn't just returned, it had been reinforced with steel. "Duyun?" she whispered, her hand tightening on the strap of her laptop bag. He didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the phone. "I was beginning to think I was wrong," he said, his voice stripped of all its recent warmth, reduced to the dry rasp of a desert wind. "I thought the textbooks were the truth. I thought the scars I showed you actually meant something to you." He finally turned his head and the look in his eyes was worse than anger. It was the look of a man who had already decided she was dead to him. "But you're just a better actress than Yuna was." He tossed the phone toward her. It skidded across the floor, stopping inches from her boots. "Found behind your headboard. Encrypted messages to Chairman Ryu's enforcer. Every shipment schedule for the next 3 months, timestamped during the hours you claim to be studying macroeconomics." Aaliyah stared at the device as if it were a venomous snake. "I've never seen that in my life. Duyun, look at me, I don't even know who Ryu's enforcer is." "That's what they always say," he snapped, the first crack of raw, jagged pain breaking through his clinical exterior. He stepped toward her and for the first time the atmosphere didn't feel electric with tension. It felt lethal. "The bank transfers Jinwoo found in your name. They matched the tuition payments you were so proud of. Did you think I wouldn't check? Did you think I was so blinded by this weakness I felt for you, that I wouldn't see the noose you were tightening around my neck?" Aaliyah backed away, her books feeling like lead weights. The man standing before her wasn't the man who had shared his trauma in the laundry room. He was the head of a syndicate, a judge preparing for an execution. The suspicion in the room was so thick it was suffocating. "I didn't do this," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Someone is playing you, Duyun. They're using your past to make you blind." "Get out of my sight," he whispered, the words vibrating with a lethal finality. "Before I remember that the penalty for treason in this house isn't just an eviction." He turned his back on her, returning to the shadows of his office, leaving Aaliyah standing in the cold, bright light of a life that had just been systematically erased. Aaliyah didn't leave. She couldn't. If she walked out now, she would be proving him right, leaving him trapped in a world where everyone was a traitor and every shadow held a knife. She waited until the penthouse fell into a tomb-like silence, watching the line of light beneath Duyun's bedroom door vanish. He was resting, but it wasn't sleep. It was the heavy, drug-like exhaustion of a man who had let himself believe in something, only to have it shatter. She moved toward the one place she was forbidden to enter. His private office. The air in the hallway felt colder as she approached the heavy mahogany double doors. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that threatened to choke her. She knew the consequences. In Duyun's world, a maid caught in the sanctum of the boss was a spy to be eliminated, not a woman to be questioned. She reached for the keypad, her fingers trembling. She didn't have a code, but she had a memory. She thought back to the laundry room, to the charred photo and the silver scar. She thought of the man who hid his grief behind tattoos and violence. Most people chose codes based on strength or vanity, but Duyun lived in the past. She entered the date she had seen on the back of his mother's old locket, a date he had whispered once in a moment of semi-conscious vulnerability, 0-4-2-7. The lock disengaged with a heavy, mechanical thud. The office smelled of old paper, expensive scotch, and the faint, lingering scent of Duyun's tobacco. She ignored the stacks of cash and the dossiers on rival families, moving straight for the terminal on his desk. It was logged into the syndicate's internal server, the digital reality Jinwoo had constructed. Her eyes scanned the logs, her mind racing to process the complex spreadsheets. She found the betrayal file, the list of outgoing messages and the coordinates of the shipments allegedly leaked to Chairman Ryu. She cross-referenced the metadata, looking at the exact seconds the messages were sent. A sob of pure, adrenaline-fueled relief caught in her throat. Every single transmission, the 7:15 p.m. leak on Wednesday, the 8:45 p.m. security bypass on Friday, matched the exact minutes she had been sitting in the front row of her macroeconomics lecture. She wasn't just looking at evidence of her innocence. She was looking at a pattern of deliberate sabotage. The messages hadn't been sent from her phone. They had been routed through the penthouse's internal Wi-Fi while she was miles away, using a ghost protocol that only someone within Duyun's inner circle could access. She began to download the logs onto her own device, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her wide, terrified eyes. She finally had the truth, but as a floorboard creaked in the hallway behind her, she realized that the truth might be the very thing that got her killed. The shadows in the corner of the office shifted, coalescing into the sharp, predatory silhouette of Seo Jinwoo. He didn't look like a man caught in a lie, he looked like a man finishing a chore. The clinical click of a handgun being cocked echoed through the silent room, vibrating in Aaliyah's marrow. "You were always too smart for your own good, Aaliyah," Jinwoo said, his voice a smooth, terrifying contrast to the adrenaline coursing through her veins. He stepped into the blue light of the monitor, the barrel of the weapon aimed directly at her chest. "I expected you to run when the boss broke your heart. I didn't expect you to play detective." Aaliyah gripped the flash drive in her pocket, her knuckles white. "He trusted you. You're the one who's been bleeding him dry for Chairman Ryu." Jinwoo gave a short, mirthless laugh. "Do-yoon became a liability the moment he started looking at you instead of the bottom line. He's soft now. Broken. I'm just putting the syndicate out of its misery." He moved toward her, his eyes cold and empty. "Give me the drive, Aaliyah. I'll make sure your death is quicker than what Ryu has planned for the boss." As he reached for her, Aaliyah's survival instincts, honed by years of navigating the dangerous streets of Chicago, flared to life. She didn't scream, she didn't plead. Instead, she swung her heavy laptop bag with a desperate, lunging force, catching Jinwoo across the temple. The surprise of her aggression sent him stumbling back, his first shot grazing a crystal decanter on the desk, shattering it into 1,000 glittering shards. She scrambled over the mahogany desk, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her ribs. She didn't run for the door, he would catch her there. Instead, she dove for Do-yoon's private emergency comms console. With blood trickling from a cut on her hand, she slammed her thumb onto the panic transmit button. She didn't send a plea for help. She sent the truth. She uploaded the cross-referenced logs directly to Do-yoon's personal device, along with a 3-second audio recording she had triggered the moment she heard Jinwoo's voice. Do-yoon became a liability? I'm just putting the syndicate out of its misery. The message hit Do-yoon's phone with a piercing, high-priority alert that shattered the silence of the penthouse. Jinwoo lunged again, pinning her against the glass window, his fingers tightening around her throat. "It doesn't matter," he hissed. "He won't get here in time." But Aaliyah looked past the traitor's shoulder, her eyes wide as the office doors were kicked open with a violence that shook the foundations of the building. Do-yoon stood there, not as the man who had been heartbroken, but as the monster he had tried to suppress. In his hand was the phone she had just shattered his world with, and in his eyes was a lethal promise that Jinwoo would never see the sunrise. The rooftop of the syndicate's new headquarters offered a view of Seoul that was no longer suffocating but infinite. 6 months had passed since the night the office windows had shattered, and with them, the last of the walls Han Do-yoon had built around his heart. The shadows of the penthouse had been replaced by the warm amber glow of a spring sunset, reflecting off the white silk of Aaliyah's wedding gown as she stood beside the man who had traded his armor for a vow. Do-yoon stood at the podium, his hand resting firmly and possessively in Aaliyah's. He no longer looked like a predator in a dark room. The tattoos that once served as a shield against the world were tucked neatly beneath the sleeves of a bespoke suit. He looked toward the crowd of dignitaries and scholars, his voice steady and devoid of its former coldness. "I spent my life believing that trust was a debt I couldn't afford to pay," he began, his eyes drifting to Aaliyah with an intensity that made the breath catch in her throat. "I thought that by controlling everything I was safe. I was wrong. True power isn't found in what you own, but in who you are willing to fight for." With a slow, deliberate movement, he pulled back a heavy velvet cloth to reveal a plaque that shimmered under the stage lights. The Gloria Mitchell Foundation. Aaliyah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes stinging with sudden hot tears. She looked at the name of the mother she had lost, the woman whose sacrifice had driven her to study by candlelight in a cold penthouse. "This foundation," Do-yoon continued, "is endowed with $50 million to ensure that students who have been forced into the shadows, students like my wife, never have to choose between their survival and their dreams. It is a bridge for the brilliant ghosts of this city to finally be seen." The applause was a distant roar compared to the silence that passed between them. Aaliyah leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. She was no longer a maid navigating a minefield, and he was no longer a boss waiting for a knife. They were partners in a shared redemption. As the first song began to play and the city lights sparkled below like fallen stars, Do-yoon led her to the center of the floor. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear as they began their first dance as husband and wife. "I love you," she whispered, her heart finally light, finally home. "I love you more," he replied, the words a sacred promise. The man who had never shown emotion held her as if she were the only thing of value in the world, finally stepping out of the darkness and into the light of their new life together.